Alright, so now we're going to talk a little bit about texturing metal. There's just a million different ways that you can texture metal. In the studio we have a rolling mill that we do a lot of our texturing with, and we have a bunch of different little punches that you can use to like put little shapes and letters and things like that. But without those, you still have plenty of options though for texturing your metal. So most of the texturing we're going to do is going to involve hammering. Well, all of it is. And it's just going to be different methods of hammering. So the simplest texture that you can start thinking about is you take your ball peen hammer and you're just going to use your ball peen hammer to do a hammer texture. So each little strike So once you've got that done a little bit, you can see that I've got a cool little hammer texture going there. And I can texture this whole surface like that. I can texture some of it. It really is up to you how you want to go about that. So that's the most obvious way to texture, is to use the ball peen and do a ball peen hammer texture. It's pretty, it's a pretty good looking texture. Lots of people want to use it. So the other approaches that we can do are to get a little more creative. We can go out and look for things like a beat up old hammer that already has a cool texture on the end of it. If I use that, you can see it creates a really neat texture without having to have a fancy tool of any kind. I've got a cool texture that starts to create. Now, I can think about, while I'm hammering, you'll see that it starts to affect the back quite a bit. So you want to think about that too. One of the ways to deal with that is to texture both sides. When you're hammering the other side, you have a tendency to kind of knock out the texture of the other side, but not too bad, especially if you're going to do like a ball peen on both sides. So I can, go ahead and address that by texturing with the ball peen on both sides, and it'll look the same on both sides. But a lot of times you only have one side that you're going to have exposed anyway. So we'll look at some of these other little tricks that we can do. So one of the things we can do is we can look for stuff to hammer into our metal. Now, when you're doing this with your bench block, you don't want to have whatever you're hammering into your metal on your bench block, or you're going to ruin your block. So make sure that you're not doing that. And then don't use your nice hammer to hit the metal that you're knocking into the copper. You really only want to use your nice hammer to hit copper. So what we can do is we can take a big junky hammer and hammer directly into the block. And you can see that starts to put a pretty interesting texture on there. Of like sort of wiggly lines, so that you can hammer all kinds of things directly into your metal in that fashion. The other thing I was going to show you is another fancy hammer. You might not have access, but you might have a hammer at home that has what's called a cross peen on it. Hammers with different peens, that's the part that you hit with, will create different textures. So with the ball peen, I got that nice little round texture, but if you can find a cross peen or something like this, you can come in and start getting really cool sort of parallel line hatching kind of texture. So you can see I created a pretty neat texture with that one as well. Another thing to do is to go find something to hammer this into. So rather than bringing something on top and then hammering it, you can take this and set on something interesting and hammer into it. A good example of that would be concrete or other things.